Hi there. Well, welcome one and all. I'm Tom Hassan. I'm president of School Year Abroad. Delighted to be with you all today, particularly our guest speakers, and whom I'll introduce in a minute. But I thought I'd give you just a quick update about School Year Abroad these days. First of all, thank you for those who participated a week ago in our SYA Day. It was great to share stories. We thank those who donated on that particular day, and just the reconnections, because SYA, as I hear over and over again, is just such a special part of one's life, and to be able to share that with others who really understand how special that was and experienced it themselves. The other piece I should let you know is that the students are having a great year. You can imagine there's been, the masks, although that's starting to relax a bit in Europe. Students right now, some of them are on spring break. France will be on spring break next week. And so when they come back, actually, they only have about a month left. So the year's gone by very quickly, feels very much like SYA, which is great. And I think the students are having such a wonderful time that our admissions this year was through the roof. We have robust numbers of kids who have accepted our offer, and so we're in terrific shape. So we're coming out of the pandemic stronger than ever, and it feels really, really good. So shifting to today's program, I'm really interested because the topic is near and dear to SYA and its mission. It's all about languages, and we want to hear about how people teach them and how we support that. And then also, there are a number of languages in the world that are dying out, and how do we kind of protect them? And so this is just, I can't wait. And I thank the two people who are with me today, and that's Megan Jeffrey, SYA China class of 2004, and Danielle Bögre, Udell, Spain class of 08. And rather than me to try to capture all the great work you're doing, I'm going to ask each of you to talk about what you do, but first kind of how you got to be doing what you're doing. So why don't you, Megan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is just exciting. SYA changed my life, absolutely, in so many ways, but and it certainly set me on the course for what I'm doing today. So I'll just briefly share what I'm doing and pass it to Daniel, and then we can get the conversation started. But so I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Communication, which is a mouthful, I know, at the National Foreign Language Center of the University of Maryland. And so what we do is we do a lot around language, but one of the main things that we do is we teach language within the context in which it's spoken. So we actually teach language through current events. So that might be environment, that might be conflict, intelligence issues, any sort of realm of the language, we teach through current events. So that's our main thing. But we also are high advocates for language equity and making sure that people have access to languages that are meaningful to them. So a lot of times in the United States of America, we have typical languages. We have French, we have Spanish, we might have Chinese maybe, but we don't really have languages that are lesser known or lesser commonly taught. And so we have so many products that are free, actually, which is amazing. We have something called the portal, where we have 99 languages with over 7,000 lessons, all free, all accessible to anybody with an email address. And then we have something called Lexia, which is our free language learning app, which currently has 7 languages, and we'll be adding 12 more by the fall. And again, this is all free as well. And it's available in the App Store, and will be available in Google Play in the fall as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about what I do. Daniel?
Extraordinary. What an important thing, making sure that people have access to languages, to learning languages that aren't just the global lingua francas. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of Wikitongs, which is a nonprofit that helps people get started with language documentation and language revitalization. As Tom mentioned, there are 7,000 languages spoken or signed today, and as many as 3,000 could disappear in a generation, which would mark the loss of half of humanity's cultural, historical, and ecological knowledge. But language extinction is not inevitable. Language revitalization is possible as long as you have the resources to learn your language, teach your language, and pass your language on to the next generation. So we help people get involved with those generational processes through supporting grassroots language documentation, the creation of materials like videos, dictionaries, their archiving, their publication. And as of last year, we directly support new language revitalization projects. So once a year, people can apply to us for funding and 12 months of training and technical support to conceive of and implement the first year of a language revitalization project in their community. And this is such an apt time to be talking about our work because we are in the middle of announcing our 15 revitalization cohort members this year. I'm going to be distributing their grants later this afternoon, and they represent kind of really interesting and diverse group of languages from every peopled continent. So I'm excited to talk about them if the conversation goes in that direction, or about really anything that pertaining to these issues, because it's all very important. Oh, and I'm from SYA Spain, 2008.
That's great. You're doing amazing work. You know, I first came across your work a couple months back. In my position, I oversee marketing and communications, and a lot of times what we like to do is showcase things that are happening in the language sphere, and we put it out as news and such. And your article, we ran across an article, I don't know if it was yours or just showcasing what you do, but it was phenomenal. And then come later, finding out you're also an SOA alum, it was like, oh my God, you know, it was so cool. You do such cool stuff. And, you know, it's funny because just yesterday I was, you know, I've been looking forward to doing this for ever since, you know, we started talking about this, but especially in the last week. And just yesterday I was saying like, oh my God, I get to talk to this amazing guy tomorrow. Oh my God, like I'm so excited. So it's like, I'm like fangirling over here.
Oh, I'm excited that our work has resonated with you, and it's a treat to meet you as well. I know we've been connected over LinkedIn for some time now, and I'm actually kind of curious, if you don't mind me asking. I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but I would love to know a little bit how at the National Foreign Language Center you decide which languages to teach, right? Like, how did you, the 99 languages that you do teach, how did you arrive at teaching those, and what happens if someone arrives and is interested in a language that isn't offered? Tell me a little bit more. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah. Well, the National Foreign Language Center has over 3 decades of life, really. And I've only joined recently. And the way, so we're also a sponsored research organization. So whatever we do, we go out and look for funds. So we're not funded necessarily by the University of Maryland itself. We might have a, you know, a tiny bit of, you know, money here, but it doesn't fund our organization. So what we do is we go out and we look for grants. So we're a grant funded organization.
Mm-hmm.
We get government contracts, those kinds of things. And it really depends upon the partner or the need. So I'll talk about today and what we see the need for today. One of our projects that we're working on is African Languages Project. And within the United States, we really don't have access to studying African languages. And we have, you know, so many people here with heritages that are, you know, with displaced heritages, and people don't have access to learning perhaps a mother tongue that once was. And so that's been a priority for us lately, is looking for funds in that direction and seeing how we might be able to develop courses in lesser known languages, particularly African languages. So that's sort of how we do things. We look at what is needed and what is not necessarily taught in terms of African languages. We can find Swahili in many places, but maybe we can't find something like Yoruba or another, so we look for areas that need attention, essentially.
That's extraordinary. There's so much institutional support needed for languages across Africa. You think about the fact that 2,000 or so of the world's 7,000 languages are indigenous to Africa, and even the African Union, right, the African equivalent of the EU, only has one African language as official. Like, its official languages are Arabic, Spanish, French, English, Portuguese, and Swahili. Only one indigenous African language official in the intergovernmental body that oversees all Africa. You look at machine translation, popular machine translation that works decently, like Google Translate. There's almost, of the 70 or so languages offered there, I think only like 3 or 4 are from Africa. And this is something that we're interested in at Wikitongs as well, because, I mean, broadly speaking, there's very little support for language revitalization in general. There's some funding available for language documentation, but the most of it is really for outside researchers, linguists who want to go document a community's language. When you start looking at support for grassroots projects, there's far, far less. And some of the regions where there is support, like where if you want to start a revitalization project or a grassroots documentation project, there is access to some kind of funding and training. That's mostly in North America, especially in British Columbia, where the First Peoples Cultural Council does really awesome work for First Nations communities there. It's run by kind of a consortium of First Nations governments and institutions. And then there's like the EU, right? But in all Africa, there's like, if you want to start a language revitalization project there, there really isn't a lot of support. And so one of our board members actually who joined us recently is from Eritrea and and does a lot of work in Africa. And my hope is that we'll be able to kind of build out a sort of a scholarship program, like a grant pool specifically for African language revitalization projects, because there's such a need. And there's just, as you've pointed out, very little support. So I think it's awesome that there's a focus on that. And I also love the idea of giving people in the US access to their heritage languages, because that's something that very few people do, but it's something that's so recent. Like, for the vast majority of us, if you go back to a grandparent, even, they weren't an English speaker, right? That's recent. And we all deserve to have access to that.
Yeah, I think, it's one of the other motivating factors that we do with whatever we do is that we want to make sure that when we go after these grant funds, that they enable us to share it with the world, so that we don't have to say, everybody has access. Oh, if you pay $99 a month, we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're really about language equity, and we're really like, living the mission that we set out to do. And so that's one of the things that I find that differs amongst language teaching organizations, is that there might be a lot of apps out there to study a language, but when you reach a certain level, you got to pay for the rest of the service. And so I think that's really been an attractive feature here. And I think it's so great what you do as well. Like, I don't find many people that are very interested in preserving indigenous languages, and especially maybe among our peers. It's easy to find a professor somewhere in anthropology who is interested in it, but to have another generation coming up who's really doing this kind of work, which I think SWA really embeds in us
Yeah.
from the start. And I actually have a question about how SWA played a role in what you do today, or even just pursuing that field, or, you know, in the past.
Yeah. I was going to ask you that same question, so I'm kind of curious what your kind of trajectory is. Yeah, that's why it was critical. So I was raised in English with some what linguists would call post-vernacular Yiddish. Post-vernacular being that when you have a family language, and you know what this means, I'm sure, but just for anyone who is watching now or will watch later, post-vernacular describes the phenomenon when you have a kind of family language or heritage language that you don't fluently speak anymore, but your speech is filled with a lot of it. You see this a lot in like first generation communities and stuff like that, right? So my dad's parents were Yiddish speakers, and he uses a lot of Yiddish in his English, or used a lot of Yiddish, you know, with me when, like, you know, if my room was messy, he would tell me to clean up my chazarai, and things like that, right? And so, but what was interesting was I didn't really know or understand that these were the remnants of a full family language, right? Like I knew that they were Jewish words, and I knew that they were ours, but I didn't realize that they were remnants of something that at least my father's family had spoken, you know, 2 generations ago. So, but otherwise, I grew up in a pretty monolingual environment, and my mom wanted me to learn Spanish and French, but that was hard in a monolingual environment. And so when I discovered SYA, it was kind of really, really exciting to her because, oh, wow, you're going to go to Spain, you're going to learn Spanish, and you're going to learn it well. And the reason that I chose Spain was simply because I happened to be taking Spanish, like so many English speaking, you know, U.S. Americans do if they're going to learn a foreign language, a second language, right? I think foreign language is kind of a icky concept that we could do without. But so when I went to Spain, the first place I traveled to outside of Saragossa, which is where SYA Spain takes place, was Barcelona. And Barcelona is the capital of Catalonia, where they have their own language besides Spanish. And it was a language that was persecuted by the Franco dictatorship between 1939 and 1978. In the 80s, when Spain became a democracy, it was endangered, and since then has had a pretty successful revitalization effort. And I decided I was going to learn Catalan, but, you know, without really understanding the kind of political tensions that I was kind of like wedging myself into, especially back in Saragossa, where I had a lot of, you know, local friends who, you know, had a lot of, you know, might not have been so supportive of that choice. But it just kind of, my whole world opened up with SYA and learning Spanish, learning Catalan. That got me thinking about my own languages, about language revitalization, about the scope and scale of linguistic diversity. And it was, you know, yeah, I don't know what my life would be without SYA. I certainly wouldn't have started Wikitongs. But what's your story?
Well, I'll tell you mine, and then after there's a question for you in the chat. So I grew up in a very multicultural community. I grew up as a Baha'i, and Baha'is are extremely diverse. So I grew up around a lot of Iranians. I lived in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. My father's background, my grandfather's from Austria. My mother was from the Eastern Shore. There was all these different dialects of English spoken, and then hints of foreign language or world language. But I was always interested in cultures and people, and I am just so enamored with anybody. It doesn't matter if you're from another country or if you're from down the street. I'm so attracted to people and their stories. And with that comes language. But I also have the added layer of a weird, quirky talent of doing imitations of people and doing impressions, especially, and picking up accents really well. And in fact, Jeff Bissell, who was the resident director of SYA China at the time, I remember at the end of the year, we were all in the classroom and he warned everybody about being around me. And initially I was like, oh man, I'm in trouble. And then at the end he said, because Megan's going to, soak you up and then spit you right back out. You got to be very careful being around her. And it actually kind of led to what I'm doing today. I pick up languages very easily, particularly accents. I'm really, really good at accents. Maybe I won't know how to write a whole essay in Mandarin or whatever, but I can speak as though I'm like a native speaker. And that's for any language that I learn. So I actually have taken a little bit of a detour outside of my professional role, and I'm a comedian and I do a lot of impressions in the Trinidadian accent, which has gotten me over 100,000 followers on TikTok. So it's really wild. But yeah, that's SWA kind of like really helped me on that path because and I also should say that I had a friend who studied on SWA China prior to me, and I looked up to her, and so I just basically did what she did. It didn't actually matter that SWA was this amazingly prestigious, institution that sent students overseas. That didn't register for me. And when I actually got in, and I sometimes I think that they made a mistake because I was like, are they sure that they want me to go? And in fact, I have a really funny story about when I was offered an SWA spot. I thought they were joking with me. I thought it was a cruel joke. When whomever called me and offered the position, if you will, they said to me, we would like to see you in China next year. And I said, okay, but I have to get there myself. The guy was just like, what are you talking about? Like, is your parent around? So anyway, it took until the day prior to me leaving for China to realize that I got to go on this amazing program. I'm sure that what was that? What was the disease that happened back in the day? It's kind of like COVID. I'm forgetting it. I can't believe.
Oh, it was one of the. It was a flu thing, right? Like swine flu or something like that. SARS. Yeah. I'm sure SARS had to play a role in why SWA accepted me, this girl from Baltimore City. But anyway, I just I'm so happy that I did, because when I came back, it changed my life. I majored in Chinese. Everything in my life has revolved around China and other cultures ever since then. I mean, SWA was made for me and I was made for SWA, I think. So yeah, cool. Anyway, I've taken up too much time. And there is a question for you in the chat that says, what is your view of saving languages that are alive and well, but vulnerable to social changes in the next generation? This is the case for many languages of the Amazon, where I've been professionally involved for many years. Bon dia, John. That's a great question. I mean, I'm all for it, of course. Funny enough, we publish a resource that we call that's intended for people who are trying to think about starting a language revitalization project in their community, and we actually call it the Language Sustainability Toolkit. Language sustainability, not language revitalization, because language revitalization kind of implies that a language is, officially endangered, and, then you're going to revitalize it, and then it's good, it's revitalized, and you're done. And what we're really talking about here is the process of keeping your language alive, of passing it on to the next generation, right? And so there are a lot of languages for which that work is really, really urgent, even if they might not formally be classified as endangered by UNESCO or linguists, but that's kind of meaningless, right? Like, there are only 100 languages or so whose futures can pretty much be taken for granted. For the other 6,900 or so languages spoken by the rest of humanity's cultures and peoples, the future is uncertain. So even if it's, not endangered now, it may be if the community doesn't take action. All that means is that the strategies you'll deploy in sustaining your language or revitalizing your language, if you want to use that term, and I do use that term a lot because it's the more common term, they're just going to change, right? So if you're trying to reawaken a language that has 10 elder speakers left, you're going to have a very different roadmap than if you have several 100,000 speakers, and the challenges that the youngest people aren't learning it anymore, right? Like the solutions you're going to pursue in keeping that language alive is very different, but it's all important, all urgent. And in the Amazon, I mean, yes, absolutely. How important is that? These are cultures that have been stewards of the world's lungs for the past several centuries, and their genocide is, inextricably linked to the Amazon's destruction. So yeah, I mean, yes. There's a question for Megan.
Okay, so the question is, what potential paths or preparation would you suggest to aim for a career with the NFLC or a similar organization supporting the teaching of languages in context and advocating for language equity? Oh, a mouthful. Okay. There are so many things. For me, I think it's important to always remember what's important to you. And language and culture has always just been a part of who I am. And, as a 20-something, or, as a young person who's navigating this, or even, any age really, but particularly that age where you're sort of figuring out, you've got a lot of passion and fire, you want to do stuff that's important to you. And sometimes you just don't have the credentials, right? I think it's important to find even if you find yourself in a job that's not the exact title that you want, you should be finding a way to do what you love, whether that's in the job or outside of the job. And I have to say that my career sort of took a different, a detour somewhat when I fell into comedy, because I was laid off from a previous job because of COVID. I was out of work for about 1.5 years, and I was trying to figure out, I really love international relations and languages and culture and people, but then I also love this crazy comedy within, globalization and languages and culture there. So how do I marry the two? And then I stumbled upon the NFLC, and I just thought, well, where did this come from? And why didn't I know about it? The organization's mission is just, it resonates with who I am. And I think that's really important to remember when searching for careers, whether that's a job to a job to a job, or a lifelong career, whatever it might be. It's really important to always match what you're doing with what you love and what resonates with you. I think there's another chat here. So basically what I think is important is to just follow your heart and see where it ends up, and be open to different paths. And you never know. I think a lot of what I've taken away from being so successful online is that it's an amazing skill for companies to have now. And so when you can marry the two, all that, all the better. So let's see, there's a comment here. Thank you both for speaking today. I'm so passionate about the subjects you have evoked. And my question is the following. The hegemony of English has undoubtedly contributed to a more interconnected world, which can help bridge differences and create beautiful things. However, it is certainly not arbitrary that English is the international language par excellence. The fact that it is English and not Thai or Danish or Wolof is inextricably linked to the ongoing colonial imperialistic endeavors of Anglophone nations. Thus, it feels like a perpetuation of US and UK imperialism that English remains so instrumental in the international arena. So many individuals think it's a means for success, so much so that they will stop speaking their mother tongue entirely. So with this being said, how do you think we can stray away from English global hegemony while still remaining interconnected? I think the work you do is amazing and aligned with that goal. So I don't know if you want to take that on, Daniel. I'm happy to give my 2 cents. I know we're over time, but I'm happy to continue going on.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue going on too. Why don't you give your answer and then I'll give mine. And then, yeah. Because I think there's a lot to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it just depends on which lens you take it. I think what's important is the revitalization of languages and remembering that your mother tongue is just as valuable as maybe the universal tongue of this day and age, which happens to be or seems to be English. So I think how we challenge the concept that, people think English is more important is that we place equal importance on the mother tongue and why the mother tongue is so important. And it's important, in my view, because it preserves heritage and culture in this diverse world that we're in. And we can't all kind of become one color, because then the garden is only so beautiful. Whereas if we have all these beautiful colors, then the garden just becomes all that more fragrant. So, I mean, that's a very PC answer, but that's really the way I think.
Yeah, I think it's important to, I want to start by looking at the one part of the question that talks about people kind of willingly abandoning their mother tongue for English, because I think English is kind of the path to opportunity. I think there's a kind of widespread understanding that lingua francas are the primary reason that so many languages are endangered. That, you know, globalization happened, it's now mainly English, Spanish, and Mandarin, and everyone is just kind of like assimilating out of kind of soft pressure, and so they're just choosing not to teach their language, and that's that. But that's kind of not the whole story. There have always been lingua francas, as long as there has been civilization. And Lawrence is absolutely right that lingua francas become lingua francas because they're the mother tongues of conquerors, the people who forge empires, right? Before, you know, so English, Spanish, and Mandarin, I think, are self-evident in their relationship to historic empires. But let's look at other lingua francas. Arabic became a major global language because of the Caliphate, which was an empire. Russian became a major global language because of the Russian Empire. In pre-Columbian America, right? Nahuatl was a major lingua franca because of the Aztec Empire. I mean, they weren't actually called the Aztec Empire, but that's what we call them in English, and, you know. So lingua francas exist because empires kind of imposed them, but the rate of language extinction that we're experiencing now is historically unprecedented. And that's because lingua francas have historically and can coexist with regional local languages. But in the 18 and 1900s, there was a concerted effort by most governments to eradicate minority populations, either through physical genocide or a kind of softer cultural genocide. Sometimes the two went hand in hand. So in the US until 1978, it was mandatory for indigenous children to attend, you know, so-called boarding schools, which were really assimilation camps where they were abused physically, psychologically, and punished often violently if they were overheard speaking their languages. So the children who survived those schools, and I say survived because at least in Canada, which had a similar system, they're unearthing tons of mass graves at the sites of these former schools. So they really were physically unsafe places, but there's much to their children. In France, to this day, you can know languages. If you live in Brittany, you can't expect to go to school in Breton. The list goes on and on. You can't really find a country that didn't do this to its minorities until very, very recently. So it's not like a kind of natural outgrowth of English hegemony that so many languages are endangered, but the kind of intended consequence of genocidal assimilation policies that pervaded until very recently. So the first thing is that most countries, with few exceptions, don't do this anymore. That's a really important first step to moving away from the hegemony of a few languages. A very small handful of, and that is so honestly need to be, we need to encourage people to take pride in who they are, to take pride in where they come from. And we should encourage all people to think about what their ancestral languages are, right? I actually, someone donated to us recently and I asked them what their ancestral language was. And they said, no, I have no heritage languages, which what a funny thing to say. Of course he does. Everyone has an heritage language, right? And so how do you as an individual participate in that? Well, you can start by becoming more educated about your heritage languages. Maybe try learning your heritage languages, become aware of the heritage languages of wherever you live. Here in New York, that might be Lenape, right? If you're in southern France, maybe that's Basque. Become aware of original place names and just practice multilingualism, right? In any way that you can. Speak all your languages all the time, and don't be embarrassed about not speaking English or Spanish or whatever the locally dominant language is. But I don't think that we necessarily need to get rid of lingua francas because, as I said, they've kind of always existed. There's this one linguist, Gilad Zuckerman, who works with a lot of Aboriginal Australian revitalization projects, and he has this idea that everyone should know at least 4 languages, and that's a lingua franca, a global lingua franca, a regional lingua franca, the language of their community wherever they live, and their heritage language. And maybe a 5th language, which is like something that's important to you. So if you like opera, maybe you should be learning Italian, who knows? Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question. And then, of course, on a political policy level, you should always support language revitalization and multilingual policies and stuff like that, if that's even up for a vote in your country.
That's a great response, Daniel. I just want to get to some of the comments. John would like to connect with you and offers his email. But School Year Abroad asked this question. I think that you would be good to answer this one as well. I think it is more geared towards what you do. Is there value in capturing large amounts of recorded speech in endangered languages if it is not transcribed, translated, analyzed, or part of a specific program? And then why aren't we building large corpuses of raw data? Is that really not worthwhile?
I certainly think it's important. When people come to us and say, I want to document my language, what we tell them to do is get out your phone and just start recording speakers in your community. And we recently put together a protocol for eliciting oral histories. So, if you run through this list of questions, it could get up to like 8 hours of speech with someone. Might take a week to do, unless someone's literally going to sit and talking at your phone for 8 hours. But raw speech is super important, especially if your language is really endangered. Like, you want to get the audio down while the speakers are still alive. Of course, if you're unable to transcribe or translate it and all the speakers die, this becomes audio that's much harder to work with. So both are kind of important, but I would say in order of operations, it's absolutely video or audio, record the speech, get it raw, and then, after the fact, try transcribing and translating. Analyzing is tougher just because that takes a really, really long time to do manually, and it takes a lot of linguistic training to be able to do. Transcribing and translating to a lesser extent. We should be building much larger corpuses. I think one of the reasons we're not doing it is there isn't a ton of funding for this, and it can often be challenging to get the equipment to where it needs to be and to sit the elders down and do it. But there are a lot of communities that are trying to work on this stuff in like local settings. It would be really cool in my mind if all of this could be fed into a single corpus, because that would open the door to some really crazy and interesting machine translation possibilities. But there are ethical problems there because historically marginalized communities, especially like indigenous communities in North America, don't love the idea of handing over IP to outside projects, and their suspicion of that is, I think, entirely understandable. And then sometimes also recorded speech might contain things that are culturally sensitive and, again, not totally up for general consumption. But I would love to see more coordinated efforts to build big corpora of speech. And I say video over audio because then you can get sign languages as well. And, you know, of the 7,000 or so languages, 300 or 400 at least are sign languages. So, yeah, so it's super important.
That's great. So I know that we only, I guess we'll go until 1. We only leaves us with like 15 minutes. Are there other, I guess this is prime opportunity for anyone in the chat to ask a question. Otherwise, Daniel, what's on the horizon for you and Wikitongs?
Well, my hope is that we can stabilize and scale our direct support for revitalization projects. So we have this current thing where once a year we're going to give grants and training to a cohort of people starting to do mother tongue work in their community, 15 this year, 25 next year, 35 the year after that. I would love to get to a place where we could support up to 200 projects a year, right? Because if you could support language revitalization at that scale, you could maybe measurably slow the trend of language extinction. Because there's only about 7,000 languages, right? Like, this is a pretty finite problem. So if you're thinking about 3,000 languages are endangered, if you could get revitalization resources, some funding and training to speakers from half those communities, you would initiate the process of reawakening half the world's endangered languages. So my hope is that we can do that. And I think a part of that will also involve figuring out how we can help communities, develop sustainable revenue streams to support their work in the long term, right? We're on a philanthropic treadmill, and that's hard enough as a nonprofit. To be a language community who's on that treadmill for, saving their culture that's just not sustainable, and it's not scalable. What are the 15 communities we're working with? Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll list them right now. And we're going to be announcing them over the next week on Twitter and Facebook and all that. And we're actually launching a section on the website today. So Wikitongs, you can find us on all platforms as there. And then the website is wikitongs.org. But I'll list the communities right now. We've got the Quechua Chanca community. So this is Ayacucho Quechua in Peru. Taivoan, which is an indigenous Taiwanese language, Tlingit, which is an indigenous language in Alaska, Yucatec Maya, which is self-evidently a Mayan language from Mexico, Dogon, which is a language from Mali, Scots, not to be confused with Scottish English or Scottish Gaelic, it's a Germanic language, it's a close cousin of English, Louisiana Creole, not to be confused with Louisiana French. Louisiana Creole is not a dialect of French, but its own language akin to Haitian Creole. Muskoke, which is a Muskogean language from what is now Florida and Oklahoma. Nubian from Egypt. Huedam, which is an indigenous South African language. A language from Alaska that is known in English as Upper Tanana River language. I have the indigenous names for it written down, but I don't know how to pronounce them, and I don't want to mess that up. So we're gonna leave it with the English name. Sheret and Hobyot, which are 2 indigenous Arabian languages from Oman. So these are Semitic languages like Arabic or Hebrew, but all critically endangered. There's a handful of indigenous South Arabian languages. Anindilyakwa, Sorry, my program director is better. If she were here, she would have pronounced that better than I would. That's an indigenous Australian language. Vimisoris, which is a critically endangered Germanic language from Poland. And finally, Raji, which is an indigenous language to India. It's got about 100 speakers left. And I should acknowledge that I'm using the term indigenous here very loosely. We could have a whole conversation about what exactly that means. And you can get involved by subscribing to our newsletter at wikitongs.org, following us anywhere. If you have specific skills that you want to donate your time with, like you're a designer or you think you could support any of these projects in some way, just write to us, revitalization@wikitongs.org or hello@wikitongs.org. And if you have a language that you speak and want to revitalize, just keep an eye out. We'll open up applications for the next round later this year.
That is fascinating, just fascinating work. Oh my goodness.
How about you? What's on the horizon for you? I've been talking way too much.
No, it's all very interesting. So what's on the horizon for me as an individual or for the National Foreign Language Center? And maybe they're synonymous, who knows? But within my role at the National Foreign Language Center, what we really are hoping to do is really get our work out there. And we really want people to be aware that there's so much free stuff that we have to offer. We really want to get this widespread so that people start to learn and know that there's no commercial angle to the products that we have. With that being said, we also are looking for sources of funding to fund more work in these areas, particularly African languages area, but also helping with current issues like, obviously there's the Ukrainian conflict right now. And so part of what we're doing at this point is, a lot of work in that area with those types of languages. But we're venturing into a new area soon, and we're just really excited with the work that we do. So, yeah.
Incredible. Maybe there's some way we can join forces on the question of African languages.
Yeah, we should set up a meeting, absolutely, and talk about some of the ways that we could collaborate, if nothing else, supporting one another in our endeavors. I think it makes sense. I think a lot of what strikes me and is really sad is that when you have organizations that do the same things, many times they get into competition and it becomes fierce when we really have the same missions to unite people, given history and global cultures and peoples and dialects and diversity, and we're all rallying around the same cause. So it would be great to support one another in these endeavors. And I think this is also an area that we could go forth into more. And then the other thing, what I was going to ask you, and I don't know if you've done this yet, but I was thinking, have you done a TED Talk yet?
I have, yes.
Okay. I was thinking like, oh my God, I want to watch this guy do a TED Talk. And
Oh, yeah, I'll send you the link. It was, if you just go to the TED website and Google my name or language revitalization, it should come up. It was in 2019. Really, really good experience, actually. Have you done a TED Talk?
No, I have no reason to at this point.
I don't know if that's true. I think you have an interesting story, and you have things to say about language diversity, and all you need is an interesting story and an idea.
Well, that I have. Actually, I was going to ask you, and I know there's one more question that's lingering for us to answer, but I was going to ask you if you thought that accented Englishes do you consider them another language? Because, a lot of times people will ask me to do a different accent, in my comedy side. They'll say, do this accent, do that accent. And I really feel like accents are not even big enough to encompass another accented English. A lot of people just dismiss it as, oh, it's just English, but it's really got a whole set of vernacular, a whole set of everything and intonations and everything. Particularly, Trinidad plays a huge role in my life because my children are half Trinidadian, and it's really important for me that they retain that heritage of theirs. But also, I've been around Trinidadian so long that I've picked that accent up very well. And so anyway, what's your thought on accents being another language?
I mean, there's an axiom attributed to the Yiddish-speaking linguist Max Weinreich, who said, or who he is said to have said, that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, right? Like the distinction between language and dialect is a political one. It's not a hard scientific boundary. Linguists often talk about dialect continuums and speech continuums because that's kind of how human language really exists. To be sure, there are exceptions to this rule. There's a pretty hard boundary between like Basque and Spanish, for example, right? Basque being an indigenous Iberian language that has been spoken since before the Romans arrived in Iberia, thousands of years ago. But for the most part, languages kind of exist on a gradient. And the boundary between language and dialect is kind of more of a cultural one. Like a language is kind of when a group of, it's like a nation, right? It's like when a group of people self-identify as speaking a language, well, then they have a language now, right? Accent is a really interesting term because you just said something that I think is really strikingly true, which is that accent isn't enough to describe it, and that's because really like accents are like a component of dialectal varieties, speech varieties that might have their own vocabulary, that might have their own grammatical rules. And I'm not talking about standardized grammar, which is something that is like officially agreed upon and put in a book, but I'm talking about how the words just naturally come out, because all speech has an inherent grammar. And it doesn't always agree with standardized grammar. And so sometimes a dialectal variety might actually, you could make a case that it is a different language, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is just a dialectal variety, but that doesn't make it less important, right? Like Louisiana French, which is close to Acadian French, probably a variety of Acadian French, you know, North American French more broadly, this is a really cool variety of French. You know, they roll their R's like they did in France historically, and like most Romance languages continue to. There's influence from English and Spanish and some indigenous languages. It's cool. Like, that should be preserved just because it's cool. I don't think we need to go out of our way to call it another language, you know, just because in order to justify keeping it alive, right?
Yeah.
With Trinidadian, it gets interesting though, right? Because in the Caribbean, there's almost every country has its own English Creole language, which is its own language. And that forms like a really close continuum with the local variety of English. Right. So like, when does Trinidadian English and when does, you know, Trinidadian Creole, like when does one stop and when does one begin? When is Jamaican English? When is it Jamaican English and when is it Jamaican Patois? Those are very fuzzy boundaries. And I don't know, did I answer the question? I feel like I just kind of rambled about the different things there.
I love your rambles because it makes sense in my head. And I think this is probably why we both went to SYA. I do think we have one more question. Let's say to the question about apps. Megan may know this, but fellow SYA China alum Michael Love, China OO, or I guess developed Pleco while he was a student with SYA. Oh, very cool. Okay, so it says translation apps, including voice activated, are now making it possible to communicate across languages really easily. Is this good or bad for language learning and cross-cultural interchange? In my view, anything that contributes to connecting with another culture is a good thing. Now, whether it's the best thing as in terms of translating, I don't think we're really, you know, it's got a long way to go, right? It's not perfect, it's still a computer. So it's not an intelligent being like the people having the conversation. So in that regard, yes, we have so much we could go and further improve technology. But in the regards of like connecting, using anything to help connect with the person, because I believe what a language is really about connecting with someone. And whether you, when you learn a little piece of a language, you're trying to show forth love to the other person, that you are interested in them and that they are worthy of your attention. And that is the basis of language. It's connecting with people. And it's less about like, you know, oh, you didn't say this right, or, oh, you know, the gist is there, the love is there, the intention is there. And that's, again, I have this very PC, you know, love kind of worldview, but I really think that's what the basis of it is. It's about connecting with other people. And that's what we are here to do. Anyway, I'm going down a different path, but you know, that's my take on that.
I couldn't agree more. Always try to speak. I think that's one of the things that stops people from trying, is they don't want to mess up the language. They don't want to, you know, they don't want to butcher it. They don't want to sound stupid, but like to just kind of assume that the lingua franca is better, like that's a much bigger imposition than like trying to speak someone's language and failing. And if we stopped thinking about language as like this something that's in a box, and that we're going to master, as opposed to something that is dynamic and kind of shape-shifting and something that we're always going to have a relationship with, like the people who speak it, then it becomes a lot more fun. But I mean, I think that the translation apps and all that stuff can be really good supplements to language learning, right? Because, you know, you can use them to try and like translate components of a sentence or something like that. I don't know. I think that they're helpful, or can be helpful.
Yeah, I think we're both in agreement with that. I know we're 1 o'clock now. Please accept our gratitude for joining us today in this fascinating conversation. I've learned so much from you, Daniel. And I want to also thank School Year Abroad for putting this on. It is such an honor, such an honor. SYA totally changed the trajectory of my life. I'm sure, Daniel, it's got a lot of influence in what you do, and I have heard nothing but good things from SYA alumni, attendees, and anyone interested in studying abroad. I am a walking advocate. I am a poster board for SYA. So yeah, again, thank you so much. Daniel, thank you. We will be in touch as well.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, and it looks like we thank everyone for joining us today and for keeping language and culture alive. So a recording of this will be shared. And Daniel, if you want to share any last remarks as well.
Just appreciate the opportunity to have had a chat with you, Megan, and you know, kind of indirectly with the people who asked questions. So yeah, thank you, SYA.